Hi everyone, in this time-lapse video I'm going to show you a few tips and techniques that I like to use when painting black fur. Now this was a pet portrait that I was asked to do a few years ago and I realised I don't have a version of this up on YouTube. So as always I like to start off with the eye first. Now the reason being it is the soul and where the main expression stems from on that portrait. So I want to make sure that I've got the eye accurate from the very beginning. So most of my videos here on YouTube, you'll know that I work in small sections. Now this is now how I work for every single painting, but as I've mentioned, this was one that I did a few years ago. And here I'm working with one set base layer. This just really does show that you can use multiple different techniques to get to the same end. This is going to be down to personal preference. I have found that the more that I've painted since this one, I do like working with my smaller areas because I do find I'm a lot more motivated and efficient with how I work. The painting ends up looking the same, but I don't hesitate as much throughout the process. And what I mean by that is, throughout the layering process, when you are working with such large areas like what I am here, and you'll see this for this very first stage, I do the entire base layer of all of the dog and the chest, that you might find you become a bit overwhelmed. Now one of the other reasons why this isn't my preference is you're ending up at that ugly stage for far longer. And the reason being here, when I work with smaller areas, I will apply my additional layers on top. It's then starting to look like that dog and that reference photo. Even though it is a much smaller area, by the time I've got that one bit 80% complete and I move on to the next and I get that about the same level, I can leave that painting at the end of that day knowing that it's already looking like that photo. So if you are finding the whole process is a bit disheartening, then work with smaller areas, it will help. So on to the black fur and the base layer itself. You'll notice here that now I've got more of the area in, I'm working with soft edges and I'm really focusing on my contrast. Now this is something that I really do focus an awful lot on every single tutorial, both on YouTube and my slower versions on Patreon. I want to make sure that I've got my highlights nice and bright, but that I've also got my shadows nice and dark. That is really important. I worry far more about contrast than I do about the exact colour. So there are a couple of different elements with this reference photograph that I was working from that did require a slightly different technique. So the face was all in focus, but the body was out of focus and a little bit more blurry. So I had to make sure that when I got onto the body itself, I did really soften out and blend out my brush strokes. But going back to the face here, this is now really showing why that very first base layer is going to work to our favour if it's more soft and blended. If I had harsh start and stop points between my shadows and my highlights, these details that I'm now working on will not look soft because I'm working with so many of those harsher edges underneath. One of the things that I always want to capture with any photo with any dog, regardless of the fur type, is that I get that texture accurate. Now with a Labrador here, I want to make sure that I've got that sheen within the black fur. That's really important. But I also want to make sure that the fur looks soft. So I have to look at that reference photo and I have to make sure that I'm painting my brush strokes in the right length and the right thickness to replicate that fur texture. Now one big tip that can really help is if you're working on a painting, you can print out that reference photo the same size as your painting and then you'll be able to clearly see how long each of your brush strokes need to be. This is something that you won't have to keep on repeating because once you've seen it, it's a lot easier to visualise and you can then transfer that across to your other paintings. But if you do find that you make your brush strokes too long and then you end up making like a Labrador, for instance, look like a coat of a German Shepherd, that's obviously not going to resemble that dog in the same way as it should. So printing off that reference photo so you can see all of those details at the right length and thickness can really help. And if you would like to see how I paint this type of fur in the significantly slower tutorial, I do have a dedicated black fur study. It's of a black Labrador, not this same painting, but it's a close-up of a beautifully detailed photograph. So if you would like to follow along to that tutorial, I will link my Patreon in the description below. And because the footage is significantly slower, I can really show you how I'm layering, the brushes that I'm using, why I'm layering in that order, and so on. I do also have a Patreon library on my website with a list of all of the tutorials in pastels and acrylics, and I will link that in the description below as well. So once I then really start to map in the first 2 or 3 layers of detail, you'll now see that I'm working in much smaller areas. I don't want to be focusing on one layers of detail at one time, I do find then it's a lot easier to make your brush strokes all the same, because we have a tendency then to get into that same repetitive motion. By only working on 2 or 3 square inches at a time, focusing on that one area, nothing else in that reference photo, I find I'm more easy to follow that reference photo closely. One thing that is really important with any fur type is that we get that fur direction accurate. If we get the fur direction wrong, it will change the shape of the animal's face. The reason being, the fur direction, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So I want to make sure that I've got that fur direction really precise. So for instance, here on the side of the face, it curves away under the eye and then it starts to slope down towards the lower right corner. That's indicating here at the sides of the face and the cheek area. Now for this, it's going to be even more exaggerated because he's panting, he's smiling. So the corners of his mouth are forcing the cheek area upwards, which is going to make more of the fur direction travel in more of an acute way. So we want to make sure that we do have that curvature in our brush strokes. But you will notice that the layering here is really crucial. It's key to getting the depth and the realism in the fur. If I was to be jumping to my brightest details early on, I'm not going to be achieving the same degree of depth within the fur. We sometimes think that longer fur requires more layers than short fur because it does look more dense, but that isn't the case. Even with something like this, I cannot jump to more my finer details that you see on top of the dog, those very bright details at the end, because I don't have any of the layers built up in between. What will happen is the portrait will look more two-dimensional, which is obviously not what we want. We want this to look like the nose is further in front and it's got that three-dimensional feel. I do find that that's all in the lighting. If you don't have your contrast accurate, you won't be able to achieve this type of effect. And the great thing with acrylics is, as long as the painting is dry and that layer that you've just done is completely dry, you can just reinforce your contrast and your colours with a simple glaze. And the glazing technique is something that I go in depth with my Patreon tutorials. But waiting for that layer underneath to dry is really important. If you're trying to apply a glaze on top of a wet layer, you will just completely lose those details. One thing here, now you can see more of the face, you'll notice that my highlights are in more of a specific area. I don't want to put those everywhere. That's going to be adjusting the light source. So the lighting on this reference photo was coming a little bit more from the right hand side. So you can see here I'm starting to reinforce more of my mid-tone highlights and then my brighter highlights on top. There is no quick way of painting fur like this when you're trying to get a photorealistic look. You'll see that I'm having to paint in every individual brushstroke. Now since this painting, I have experimented with a specific type of fur brush, which you're going to see in an upcoming tutorial when I upload the cat, which I am still working on. I've just got the last bit for the voiceover for Patreon to do, and then I'm going to create the YouTube version. You're going to see there that I've used a very specific brush to create the fur, but ultimately when you're working on this type of detail, there is no quick way of doing it. Working in individual layers and then really studying that fur direction, the fur thickness and the length is really what's going to make your painting more realistic. Now I do have a video here on YouTube sharing my top tips for painting realistic fur, so if that's of interest I'll link that in the description below. So when it comes to the body and where that fur is out of focus, I'm doing wet on wet blending. Trying to get soft edges with acrylics can be a challenge, so I've got a video on YouTube on how to blend acrylics with a couple of different methods, so if that video is of interest I'll also link it in the description below. But as I've mentioned, for this I am using the wet on wet blending technique. It's going to really help to create those soft edges, and when we get to the part of the body in a couple of seconds, you'll see how I really start reinforcing my layers. Each additional layer looks softer. And this is the biggest tip. When you're trying to get the out of focus effect, sometimes we think because it doesn't have detail visible in the photo, it doesn't require as many layers. But that's really not the case. Look here, for example, I'm still building from dark to light, but each layer has to be subtle in order to get that soft effect. Because acrylics dries that much faster, I have to build up these layers here in this way gradually to make sure that all the lines underneath are naturally getting softer. So this is certainly one of my ways that I like to create this out of focus, softer fur effect. So I really hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video are useful. If they are, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube at the weekend, but if you've got any questions, anything art related, pop them in the comments below. I am more than happy to help if I can.